The bounty notice hit the dirt at Ugak Ashwalker's bare feet before the rider had even reined in his horse, and she did not so much as glance down at it, because her eyes were already promising the man violence. 200 silver crowns, said the rider, a lean man with a scar splitting one eyebrow and a crossbow resting easy across his saddle horn. His name was Silas Marrow, and he wore the black and copper sash of Magistrate Bramwell's household like it made him something more than a hired killer. For John Crawford, dead or dragged, you seen a man come through here orc. Farmer's build, brown hair going gray at the temples, walks with a limp in the left leg. Behind him, 4 more riders fanned out along the fence line of Ashwalker Mill, their horses stamping flat circles into the golden wheat that had not yet been cut. Beyond them, the great windmill turned lazily against a sky the color of a bruise healing, its worn sails creaking in the plateau wind the way they had creaked every evening for 11 years, first for her husband and now only for her. "I have seen no farmer," Ugak said. Her voice came low and even, the voice she used on men who thought her size meant she could be talked over. She stood in the doorway of her own house with one hand resting on the frame, tusks catching the last orange light, her braided black hair pulled back tight from a face weathered by sun and grief in equal measure. She wore fitted leather work breeches and a laced deerskin vest cinched close over a linen shirt, sleeves rolled to show forearms corded with muscle from years at the millstone and the plow both. "I have seen 5 men on tired horses trample half a season's grain before evening prayers." "That is what I have seen." Marrow's mouth curled. "Careful how you speak to me, Greenskin. Careful how you speak to me in my own dooryard, little man." She did not move. Her mother had taught her that stillness was a weapon long before her husband had taught her the axe, and she used both now, letting the silence stretch long enough that one of the younger riders shifted uneasily in his saddle. Marrow swung down anyway, boots crunching in the dry grass, and came close enough that she could smell the horse sweat and cheap tallow soap on him. "The magistrate's nephew is dead, throat opened on his own steel, if you believe the fool's story, which nobody with sense does. Crawford ran the day it happened, and he ran in this direction. We tracked him to the Millpond Road not 3 miles from here before the rain took the print. Now you're going to step aside and we're going to look through your house, and if you've got nothing to hide, that costs you nothing but an hour of daylight. I have crops to bring in before the frost turns them," Ugak said, "and you have no writ from any court that lets you walk into a widow's home uninvited. I have a bounty writ signed by Magistrate Bramwell himself, which is better than any court out here, and you know it." He held up a folded parchment, its wax seal cracked open and resealed a dozen times from handling. "Step aside." She did not step aside. For 3 long heartbeats the wind was the only sound on the plateau, hissing through wheat that had turned the whole tableland the color of hammered gold, the windmills beyond her own house. 6 of them scattered across the high fields, cooperative built, each belonging to a different holding, turning slow and patient as old men nodding. Beneath the floorboards of that house, under a trapdoor hidden by a woven grain-sack rug, and a false layer of packed earth that Ugak had built with her own hands the winter after her husband died, John Crawford lay in the dark of the cellar with his knife drawn, and his heart slamming against his ribs so hard he was certain the men outside could hear it. He had been 3 days in her care, and every hour of it had felt like borrowed time he had no right to. "You'll not find him," Ugak said finally, and something in the flatness of her tone made even Marrow pause. "But if it eases your conscience, look. Look everywhere a farmer's widow keeps her secrets. Look in the flour bins and the chicken coop and under my bed if you have the stomach for it. Only know this, bounty man. The treaty your magistrate signed with my clan says a landholder's home is her own ground, and any human who forces his way into orc-held land without cause answers to the clan, not the court. You put one boot past that threshold without my leave, and I will send word to Ashwalker Reach before you've finished your search, and you can explain to my kin why you thought 200 silver was worth a war party. It was, in its particulars mostly true. The treaty existed. Whether her clan would actually ride down off the reach over one bounty hunter's boot print was a matter Ugak intended never to test, but Marrow did not know that, and she watched the knowledge of it work behind his eyes like a slow poison. "Search the barn," he said at last to his men, jerking his chin toward the outbuildings instead, and Ugak let herself breathe again, though she did not let it show. The coop. The wagon shed. Leave the house. They tore through her barn for the better part of an hour, scattering hay, appending the grain bins she had just filled, frightening her 2 mules half out of their skins. She watched from the porch with her arms crossed and her jaw set, saying nothing, giving them nothing, while beneath her feet John Crawford lay still as a corpse in the black earth-smelling dark, listening to boots stomp directly overhead, and praying to whatever gods bothered to listen to fugitives that the woman standing between him and the noose knew what she was doing. When at last the riders remounted, dusk-streaked and empty-handed, Marrow lingered a moment longer than the rest, looking Ugak over the way a man looks over a horse he suspects has been drugged calm for a sale. "You're a widow," he said. "Alone out here. That's a hard thing, I'd wager. A woman could use 200 silver crowns to make a hard life easier." "A woman could," Ugak agreed. "This one has no interest in blood money for a stranger she has never met. He's no stranger to the men he's killed." "Then let the men he's killed collect the bounty," she said, and turned her back on him, which was its own kind of insult, and walked into her house and shut the door, and did not open it again until the sound of hooves had faded entirely into the wind-song of the windmills. She stood with her back against the door for a long moment, listening to her own pulse slow, before she crossed the room, rolled back the grain-sack rug, and lifted the trapdoor. John was already climbing out before she had it fully open, pale and shaking, his knife still gripped white-knuckled in one hand. "They're gone, for now." She took the knife gently from his fingers, as though she were disarming a spooked animal rather than a grown man, and set it on the table. "You are trembling. I keep thinking about what happens if you're wrong, if they come back with more men. Torches, maybe." He dragged both hands down his face. In the lamplight he looked older than she suspected he was, lines carved deep beside his mouth, brown hair threaded through with the gray Marrow had described. His left leg twisted badly 2 years past in a fight. He never spoke of held at an angle that suggested it still pained him after a day spent crouched in a cellar. He had good shoulders, though, wide and weather-hardened, the kind of build that came from swinging something heavier than a plow for a good part of a life. "You should have handed me over, Ugak. 200 silver would see you through winters for years." "I do not sell what is not mine to sell," she said, and something in the way she said it made him look up at her properly, the way he had not quite let himself do in 3 days of careful distance, and murmured thanks passed back and forth across her cellar's darkness. "Sit. You look like a man who has forgotten what a full meal tastes like." He sat because it was easier than arguing with her, and because some traitor part of him did not want to argue with her at all. It had begun 4 days before that, on a night with no moon, when John Crawford had come stumbling out of the wheat with blood soaking through his shirt, and a dead man's face burned behind his eyes. He had not meant to kill Edric Thorne. He would say that to anyone who asked, though increasingly it seemed no one intended to ask before they hanged him for it. John had fought in the pits of Thornhollow for 6 hard years in his younger days, back when his knees still forgave him for it, and his conscience had not yet caught up to the coin, taking bouts against men and once, memorably and shamefully, against a chained-up orc brought south from some border war to be a spectacle for drunk merchants. He had won that fight, and every fight after it hated himself a little more for the winning, until the day he walked out of the ring for good, bought 40 acres of poor rented land on the edge of the Windrow Plateau, and swore he would never again earn his bread by hurting another living thing. Edric Thorne, the magistrate's nephew, had not cared about any of that. He had cared about a gambling debt and a rigged fight he wanted John to throw for a fee, And when John refused flatly, calmly, the way he refused most things that offended the only decency he had left, Thorn had come at him in the dark behind the granary with a hidden dagger, snarling about respect and money and knowing his place. In the scuffle that followed, Thorn's own blade had found his own throat, and John had stood over the body with the taste of old blood in his mouth and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has been in enough fights to know how the world receives such stories, that no one would believe a farmer's word against a magistrate's grieving family. So he had run north into the high wheat country, until his bad leg gave out entirely on the edge of a plateau crowned with turning windmills, and he had collapsed at the fence line of a farm he did not know belonged to an orc, let alone a widowed one, and Ugak Ashwalker had found him there in the wheat at dawn, more dead than alive, and made a choice that would unmake and remake both their lives. She had not intended to fall in love with him. She would tell herself that for weeks afterward, in the stubborn, private way a woman tells herself things she already knows are lies. What she had intended, that first gray morning, was simply not to let a man die in her field like a discarded thing. She had carried him slung over one broad shoulder, for he weighed little enough to her that it was no great labor, into her house, cleaned the wound in his side where a guard's spear had grazed him during his flight, and set his leg as best she could, though the old injury beneath the new one told her this was not the first time this man had been broken and put back together. "You should turn me in," he had rasped, that first night, feverish and only half lucid. "There's a bounty. Has to be by now." "There is always a bounty on someone," she had said, wiping the sweat from his brow with a cool cloth, wondering even then why her hands lingered longer than the task required. "I have never yet found a bounty worth more to me than my own conscience." He had not understood, that night, how strange a thing it was for an orc widow to say to a human stranger. He would come to understand it in time, and the understanding would undo him entirely. 3 days after the bounty men rode off empty-handed, John Crawford stood at the edge of Ugak's wheat fields in the gray hour before dawn, watching the windmills turn against a sky just beginning to blush pink, and felt, for the first time since Edric Thorn's blood had darkened the dirt behind the granary, something almost like peace. "You should not be out here," Ugak said behind him, and he startled badly enough that she laughed, a low, rich sound he had not yet heard from her, and which did something complicated to his chest. "Merrill's men are gone, but they are not stupid. They will watch the roads." "I needed air that didn't smell like your cellar," he admitted, offering her a small, tired smile. "No offense meant. It's a fine cellar. Best cellar I've ever hidden in fact." High praise from a man who has apparently hidden in several. "Only the one, if you must know. I'm new to this line of work." He turned to look at her properly. The way the growing light caught the deep green of her skin, the strong, clean lines of her face, the tusks that should have frightened him and somehow, disastrously, did not. She wore the same fitted leather vest and breeches she always wore for field work, sleeves rolled, her braid coming loose from the night's sleep. And John Crawford, retired pit fighter, fugitive farmer, a man who had told himself for 2 years that he was done wanting anything the world could take away from him again, felt something in his chest crack quietly open like ice giving way on a spring river. "Why did you help me?" He asked because he had wanted to ask it for 3 days and had lacked, until now, the nerve. "You didn't know me. You still don't, not really. I could have been exactly the murderer that bounty paper says I am." Ugak considered this for a long moment, her dark eyes moving over his face as though reading something written there that he himself could not see. "My husband," she said finally, "died 4 years ago on a border road, killed by men who decided his life was worth less than the coin his death would fetch them. I know the sound a bounty makes when it is chasing someone who does not deserve it. I have heard it before. I did not intend to hear it again and do nothing." "I'm sorry," John said quietly, "about your husband. His name was Dorez. He was a good man. A better man than most humans ever gave him credit for being, and a better man than most orcs, too, if I am honest. He had a soft heart in a hard world, which is a dangerous thing to have. She looked out over the wheat, the windmills, the long gold sweep of the plateau that had been her home and his home before her for 11 years. I have run this mill alone since. The men in Thornhollow buy my flour when their own harvest runs short and call me monster the rest of the year. I have grown used to being needed and despised in the same breath. I don't despise you, John said before he could think better of it. I think you might be the bravest person I've ever met, and I've fought men who thought bravery meant not flinching while somebody hit them. That's not what I mean. I mean you looked at 5 armed men with a legal writ and you didn't so much as blink. Something shifted in Ugak's expression, some careful wall coming down a half-inch. You flatter easily for a man hiding in a cellar. I've got nothing left to lose by being honest, he said. Seems like a good time to start the habit. She studied him a moment longer, and then, because she was not a woman who danced around what she wanted once she had decided to want it, she stepped closer, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and wheat and something warmer underneath, and said, "You are a strange little farmer, John Crawford." "Not that little," he said, and she laughed again, and this time he let himself enjoy the sound of it without flinching from what it was doing to him. They fell into a rhythm over the following 2 weeks that felt, to John, dangerously close to a life. By day he worked what he could of her fields, careful to stay behind the windbreak of trees along the north fence where the road could not see him, learning the particular ache of scything wheat with a leg that had never healed right. Ugak taught him to read the wind for the windmills, how to know when a storm was building on the horizon by the particular color the grain turned before it, gold going to bronze, going to a strange dead silver. By night they sat together at her table over bowls of barley stew, and she told him about Doraz, how he had courted her with 3 seasons of patient gift-giving, a warrior's way of proving devotion, before she had ever led him past her threshold. And John told her, haltingly, about the pits, about Edric Thorne, about the particular shame of having once made his living by hurting things for money. "I fought an orc once," he confessed one night, staring into his bowl rather than at her face. "Years back, chained fighter brought down from some border camp for a wager. I didn't know his name, I won. I've never stopped thinking about it." Ugak was quiet a long moment. "Did you want to hurt him?" "No, I wanted the coin. I told myself that made it different. It didn't." "No," she agreed, "it did not. But you stopped. You walked away from that life and you have carried the weight of it every day since, which is more than most men manage." She reached across the table and set her hand over his, her palm broad and warm and rough with the same calluses his own hands wore. "I do not love what you were, John Crawford. I am coming to love what you have chosen to become instead." It was the first time either of them had said the word love aloud, even glancingly, even wrapped in the careful shape of a sentence about something else, and they both went very still at the sound of it hanging in the lamplit air between them. "Ugak," John started, and did not know how to finish it. "You do not have to say anything," she said, though her thumb moved slowly across the back of his hand, and her dark eyes had gone soft in a way he had not seen from her before. "I am not a woman who waits patiently for a man to decide what he wants. I have buried one husband already and learned that life is too short for careful waiting. But I will not push you towards something you are not ready for either." "I've been ready," John said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. "Since the second morning, when you sat by my bed all night changing the dressing on a wound that wasn't even that bad, and fell asleep sitting up in a hard chair because you were afraid to leave me alone with the fever. I just didn't think a woman like you could possibly want a man like me. I'm a fugitive with a bad leg and a worse past." "A woman like me," Ugak repeated, faint amusement warring with something fiercer in her voice, "wants exactly what she chooses to want, and no one, not magistrate, not bounty man, not even you, John Crawford, gets to tell me otherwise." She leaned across the narrow table, slow enough to give him every chance to pull away, and did not pull away herself when he closed the last of the distance instead. his hand coming up to cradle her jaw, rough farmer's fingers against green skin gone startlingly soft at the temple, and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. Not at first. 2 years of loneliness on his side and 4 years of grief on hers came out in it, hungry and searching. But it gentled as it went on, her hand fisting in the front of his shirt, his thumb tracing the sharp, elegant line of her cheekbone, until they broke apart breathless and grinning like fools in the lamplight. "Well," John said, "that's certainly one way to answer a question." "I am not a woman who does anything by halves," Ugak said, and kissed him again to prove it. The fire came 6 days later, and it came in the night, the way the worst things always seemed to. John woke first, coughing, the smell of smoke thick enough to taste before he had even opened his eyes. He rolled out of the narrow cot Ugak had made up for him in the loft, a concession to propriety that neither of them had entirely respected in recent nights, and looked out the small window to see the whole eastern edge of the plateau burning, a wall of orange eating its way through dry wheat with terrifying speed, driven by a wind that had turned hard and hot in the last hour. Ugak. He was down the ladder in seconds, his bad leg screaming protest, to find her already at the door, pulling on her boots, her face lit orange from the glow through the windows. "Someone said it," she said grimly. "Wheat this dry does not catch itself in a windless night that has suddenly grown teeth. This has Marrow's mark on it. Burn me out, burn you out with me, and call it an accident no court need investigate. The mill can turn to ash for all I care tonight. We cannot." She was already moving, throwing what few essentials she could carry into 2 packs dried meat, a water skin, her husband's old war axe taken down from its place above the hearth, a small purse of coin she had kept buried beneath the floorboards for years against exactly this kind of ruin. "We go now, while the fire is still behind us and not around us. There is a game trail through the windbreak trees that will bring us down off the plateau by the south face before the flames catch that side." They ran, then, out into a night gone strange and terrible with light, the windmills silhouetted black against the burning sky like great slow sentinels watching their own fields consumed. Ash fell around them like gray snow. John's leg buckled twice on the uneven ground, and both times Ugak caught him before he fell, her strength absolute and unhesitating, until finally, near the tree line, she simply pulled his arm across her shoulders and half-carried him the rest of the way without breaking stride, her breath coming hard but steady, never once complaining of the weight. "You don't have to," he started. "I know what I do not have to do," Ugak said. "I am doing what I choose to do. Save your breath for running, farmer." They broke from the tree line as the first light of dawn began to compete with the fire glow, looking back from the ridge above the south face to see the whole golden crown of the Windrow Plateau burning behind them, 6 windmills standing like dark crosses against the flame, one of them, Ugak's own, already beginning to lean as the fire ate through its old timber legs. Ugak Ashwalker did not weep. John had the sense, watching her jaw tighten and her hands curl into fists at her sides, that she had spent whatever tears she owned 4 years ago on a border road, and had none left to spend on wheat and wood, however much they had meant to her. "I built that mill's roof myself," she said quietly, "the summer after Dora's died, because I did not know how to grieve except by working until my hands bled. And now it burns because a bounty man wanted 200 silver more than he wanted his own soul clean." "I did this," John said, misery thick in his voice. "This is because of me." "This is because of Sela's Marrow," Ugak said sharply, turning to face him, "and the magistrate who sent him, and I will not have you carrying guilt that belongs to other men. You did not light that fire, John Crawford. You did not choose to be born a farmer that a corrupt magistrate's nephew decided to bully. Do you understand me?" He did not fully believe her, not yet, but he nodded anyway, because the fierceness in her eyes did not seem to be leaving room for argument. They watched the mill fall, its great sail structure collapsing inward in a shower of sparks that briefly outshone the dawn, and then Ugak turned her back on 11 years of her life burning behind her and said, "We go to my clan. Ashwalker Reach, 3 days south and east through the foothills. My people will not turn away a claimed guest of the Ashwalker line, human or not, bounty or not. There is old law in this, older than Marrow's magistrate and his silver. Claimed guest, John repeated carefully. We will discuss the particulars on the road, Ugak said, and something in the set of her shoulders told him this was not a conversation she intended to have standing in the ashes of her old life. Come. The sun rises and Marrow's men will be searching the burn line by midday, looking for bones or footprints, whichever they find first. We should not be here for either. The road south and east ran through country John Crawford had never seen foothills gone from gold wheat country to rough gray stone and scrub pine, the air growing thinner and colder as they climbed, the wind carrying a bite that had nothing to do with the season. They walked mostly in silence the first day, both of them raw with the loss of the mill and the fields, John's leg aching worse with every mile, though he refused to slow their pace until Ugak simply stopped walking one afternoon and told him, in a tone that brooked no argument, that they would rest whether he wished it or not. You are a stubborn man, she said, examining his leg where he sat propped against a boulder, her fingers gentle despite the roughness of her hands as she worked at the muscle above his old injury. Dora's was stubborn too. It seems to be a quality I cannot help but be drawn toward. God's help me. Tell me about him, John said. Dora's, if you want to. I don't want you to feel like I'm asking you to forget him. Ugak was quiet a moment, her hand still on his leg. He was a warrior of my clan. Steady, patient, slow to anger, everything a good husband should be. We were matched by our elders in the old way, but we came to love each other true within a season, which is more than many arranged matches manage. He died defending a trade caravan on the border road from raiders who cared nothing for the treaty between our peoples. I was not there. I have spent 4 years wondering if I could have saved him had I been. You couldn't have known. I know that with my head. My heart has been slower to learn it. She looked up at him then, something raw and honest in her dark eyes. I did not think I would want anyone again, John Crawford. I built a wall around that part of myself and told myself it was strong enough to hold forever. You climbed over it without even trying, which I find more irritating than I can properly express. I could try to climb back over it if it'd make things simpler, John offered, though his voice was soft, teasing gently at the edges of something much more serious. Do not you dare, Ugak said, and pulled him into a kiss fierce enough to steal the breath from both of them. There on the mountain road with the whole ruined plateau smoking somewhere behind them and an uncertain future waiting ahead. They reached the market town of Greywater Crossing on the evening of the second day, a walled settlement built where 2 trade roads met at a stone ford, its market square still busy with the last stragglers of the days trading despite the gathering dusk. It was, Ugak explained, the last human holding before the foothill road climbed properly into Orkheld country, and they needed supplies for the final push to Ashwalker Reach dried food, a new water skin, a poultice for John's worsening leg. And so they risked it, John's hood pulled low, his gait deliberately slowed to disguise the limp that might mark him from a wanted poster's description. It was not enough. They were 3 stalls into the market, Ugak haggling over dried meat with a wary but businesslike trader, when a guard captain's shout cut across the square. That's him. That's Crawford, the Thornhallow murderer. Someone hold him. The square erupted into motion, merchants scattering, a knot of town guardsmen converging from the direction of the ford gate with spears leveled, and John felt the old cold clarity of the pit-fighting years settle over him even as his stomach dropped through the earth. There was no running from this, not with his leg, not through a crowded square, and every instinct honed by 6 years of fighting for his life in a ring told him the only options left were surrender or death. Ugak Ashwalker chose a third option no one in that square, least of all John, had seen coming. She stepped between him and the leveled spears, her husband's war axe already free of its strap and held loose and easy in one hand, not raised in threat but simply present, a fact as immovable as stone, and her voice rang out across the whole gone-silent square with the force of a woman who had decided, in that single heartbeat, exactly what she intended to be true for the rest of her life. "This man is my husband," Ugak declared, loud enough that even the merchants at the far stalls turned to stare. "Claimed under the old right of the Ashwalker line, bound to my clan by blood claim these 2 months past. Any hand raised against him is raised against Ashwalker Reach itself, and you may explain to my clan chief why you thought a human magistrate's silver worth more than the treaty your own governor signed in blood not 10 years gone." The captain of the guard, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache and the look of someone who had signed up for a quiet posting collecting tolls at a river ford, and never once expected to be caught between an orc widow's axe and a clan war, faltered visibly. "Blood claim," he repeated. That's clan law. That doesn't apply to a bounty writ from Thornhollow. That's a human court's business. It applies the moment you draw human steel on Ashwalker property," Ugak said, and there was nothing but ice-cold certainty in her voice, no hint that the words she spoke were, in that moment, entirely and audaciously untrue. "Ask any trader who runs this crossing regularly whether the Ashwalker clan makes idle threats. Ask them what happened to the last raiding party that thought our treaty was worth less than the parchment it was written on." A murmur ran through the crowd. Clearly some among the traders knew enough of the Ashwalker clan's reputation, or simply enough of orc clans generally, to find the threat entirely credible, and the guard captain's spear point wavered, then lowered a fraction, then a fraction more, as the calculation played out plainly across his face. 200 silver crowns for a farmer was a fine bounty, but it was not worth provoking a clan war on the border, not for a captain with a garrison of 11 men and a governor 2 days' ride away who would answer none of his letters in time to save him. "You'll swear this before witnesses," the captain said finally, some last shred of duty making him grasp for a compromise. "The blood claim, sworn on record that this is truth and not some trick to save a killer's neck." "I swear it," Ugak said, without a flicker of hesitation, "on the memory of my first husband, on the honor of the Ashwalker line, before every soul in this square as witness. John Crawford is mine, claimed and bound, and the man who tries to take him from me will answer to my axe before he ever sees a courtroom." It was, John thought dazedly, watching her stand there with her chin high and her axe steady, and her whole considerable presence daring anyone in that square to test her, possibly the single most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed, and he was fairly certain his heart had simply stopped working correctly somewhere in the middle of it. The captain lowered his spear fully. The other guardsmen followed his lead, muttering among themselves, and the crowd's tension broke into a low buzz of scandalized, delighted gossip that would, John suspected, carry the tale of the orc widow and her claimed human husband to every trading post within 100 miles by week's end. "This isn't finished," the captain warned, though the fight had gone out of his voice. "Word goes to the magistrate regardless. This is above my post." "Send your word," Ugak said. "I fear no magistrate's letter." She did not lower her axe until the guardsmen had withdrawn fully to the far side of the square, and only then did she turn to John, and he saw, beneath the fierce mask she had worn for the crowd, something uncertain and searching in her eyes, as though she were only now realizing the enormity of what she had just declared aloud before an entire market square of strangers. "Ugak," John said quietly, drawing her a few steps aside, into the shadow of a stall awning where the crowd's attention had finally begun to drift elsewhere. "You just told an entire town we're married." "I did what needed doing to keep you breathing," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier iron. "The blood claim is real law, John Crawford, or clan law at least. It does not require a ceremony witnessed by human priests, only a declaration made in good faith before witnesses, followed by the clan's willingness to honor it. I have made the declaration. What happens now is a question of whether I meant it, and whether you would have me mean it. Would you?" John asked, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the spears that had so recently threatened his life. "Mean it, I mean. Truly." Ugak studied his face for a long moment, market noise and gossip swirling forgotten around them, and then she reached up and touched his jaw with fingers that trembled just slightly, for the first time since he had known her. "I have buried one husband already, John Crawford, and I told myself the grief of it would never again be worth risking. And then a half-dead farmer collapsed in my wheat field, and I found myself hoping, against every hard lesson I had taught myself, that I might be foolish enough to risk it again. I meant every word I spoke to that captain, everyone, if you will have me." "Have you?" John said, half a laugh breaking loose despite the tears standing suddenly in his eyes. "Ugak, I've had nothing but you since the day you didn't hand me over. I just never let myself believe a woman like you could actually want to keep me." "Then let this be the day you believe it," Ugak said, and kissed him there in the market square, in front of merchants and gossiping traders and the retreating backs of guardsmen who had very nearly ended his life an hour before. And John Crawford kissed her back with everything 2 years of loneliness and a lifetime of feeling unwanted had left dammed up inside him, and did not care, for once, who was watching. They left Greywater Crossing before full dark, unwilling to test the guard captain's patience or the speed of his letter to the magistrate, and climbed on into the foothills proper as the last light drained from the sky. The claim Ugak had made in the square had not been, in the strictest sense, a lie any longer. Not after that kiss. Not after the way she had looked at him when she said the words, "If you would have me." But it had not yet been made formal in the way of her people, either, and John found himself turning the strangeness of it over in his mind as they made camp that night in the shelter of an overhanging rock, a small fire crackling against the deepening mountain cold. "Your people," he said carefully, as Ugak worked at redressing his leg by the firelight, her touch grown familiar and easy over these past weeks. "The Ashwalker clan. When we reach them, will they accept what you claimed?" "A blood claim on a human. It has been done before," Ugak said, "though rarely, and rarer still where the human in question is wanted for murder by his own people. My clan chief is my mother's cousin, a hard woman named Grelka, and she will want to know the whole truth of what happened to Edric Thorne before she extends the clan's protection over you. I will not lie to her. I have never lied to her in my life, and I do not intend to begin over a man, however much I love him." The word love landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, and John felt his breath catch. "You love me," he said, not quite a question. "I have loved you," Ugak said, not looking up from her work, though a faint flush had darkened the green of her cheeks. "Since the third night, when you woke from the fever calling my name before you even knew my face clearly, as though some part of you had already decided I was the one worth reaching for in the dark. I did not say it sooner because I am a cautious woman where my heart is concerned. I am done being cautious now." John reached out and stilled her hands where they worked at his bandage, drawing her gaze up to his. "I love you too, Ugak Ashwalker. I think I started falling the morning you carried me into your house like I weighed nothing at all, and I have not once, not for a single day since, stopped." They came together then with none of the hesitance of their earlier kisses, John drawing her down beside him by the small fire, the mountain cold forgotten between the warmth of her skin and his, hands learning the shape of each other with a tenderness that spoke of two people who had each believed themselves too broken or too alone to ever again be chosen, finding in the other proof that they had been wrong. It was not hurried. It was not, in the end, anything but two hearts long starved for exactly this kind of belonging finally allowing themselves to be filled. And when it was over they lay tangled together beneath John's threadbare traveling cloak and Ugak's heavier one, listening to the fire pop and the wind move through the pines. And John Crawford thought, with a clarity he had not known since before Edric Thorne's blood stained the dirt behind a granary he would never see again, that he had found, against every possible expectation, the place where he belonged. "Whatever happens with your clan," he murmured into her hair, "whatever happens with the bounty, with Marrow, with all of it, I want you to know this was worth it, all of it, even the fire, even the running. I got to know you, and that alone was worth every bit of what it cost. Do not speak as though the worst is behind us and the ending already written," Ugak said, though she tightened her arms around him. "We have a mountain pass ahead of us yet, and a storm building on the southern ridges that I do not like the look of, and a bounty man who does not strike me as the sort to give up simply because a guard captain lost his nerve." She was right on all counts, and it took them only a day to discover it. The storm broke on the third day of their climb, in the high pass below Ashwalker Reach, with a violence John had never seen even in his years traveling to fighting pits across 3 provinces. It came down off the peaks with almost no warning, a wall of black cloud swallowing the afternoon sun, wind screaming down the narrow canyon trail hard enough to stagger a grown man, and then rain in sheets so thick John could barely see Ugak walking 3 paces ahead of him. And beneath the rain, worse, the sudden low roar of water finding the dry canyon floor and turning it, in the space of minutes, into a rushing brown flood. "Move!" Ugak shouted over the storm's roar, grabbing his arm and hauling him bodily toward the canyon wall, where a shelf of rock rose above the rapidly filling channel. "The water rises faster than you can outrun it on that leg. Climb, John, climb now." He scrambled up the rock face with her boosting him from below, fingers slipping on wet stone, his bad leg screaming useless protest, and had just hauled himself onto the narrow ledge above when he looked back to see Ugak still below him, the flood already surging around her knees, her footing beginning to slide in the churning brown water. "Ugak!" He threw himself flat on the ledge, reaching down with both hands. "Give me your hand." She lunged upward, the flood tearing at her legs, and their hands met and locked. And John pulled with everything 2 years of farm labor and a lifetime of fighting had built into his shoulders and back, dragging her up out of the water's reach even as a fresh surge of runoff crashed through the channel below, exactly where she had been standing a heartbeat before. They collapsed together on the narrow ledge, soaked through and gasping, the storm still screaming around them, and Ugak looked at him with something fierce and disbelieving in her rain-streaked face. "You could have been swept down with me, pulling like that," she said. "You should have let go if the water took me." "Not a chance," John said, still catching his breath, his hands not yet willing to release hers. "Not now, not ever. You didn't let a bounty writ take me from you, Ugak Ashwalker. I'm not letting a flash flood take you from me. That's not how this works, not anymore." They huddled together on that ledge through the worst of the storm, sharing the warmth of both their cloaks, watching the canyon floor below churn into a temporary river that would, by morning, be nothing more than wet stone and scattered debris, and something in that shared endurance, the flood that had nearly erased them both, the desperate grip of hands refusing to let go, settled a certainty in John's chest that no amount of gentler courtship could have matched. Whatever else the world threw at them, he understood now with total clarity, they would face it together or not at all, and he found he did not fear the together part in the slightest. By the time the storm broke and the sun returned, pale and washed clean over dripping pines, they had perhaps 6 hours of daylight left to make the final climb to Ashwalker Reach, and neither of them had any illusions left about how much time remained before Sela's Marrow, storm or no storm, found their trail again. Ashwalker Reach revealed itself at dusk, rising from the last fold of the mountains, not the crude hide-tent camp John had half expected from stories told in human taverns, but a proper settlement of stone longhouses and timber halls built into a natural fortification of cliff and ridge. Dozens of cook fires already lit against the gathering dark, the sound of orc voices raised in the easy noise of an evening meal drifting down to meet them on the trail. Guards at the outer perimeter, 2 broad-shouldered orc warriors bearing spears, stiffened at the sight of a human approaching, weapons half raised, until Ugak called out in her own tongue and stepped forward into the torchlight, and John watched the tension in their stances ease into something more complicated. Recognition, welcome and open, undisguised curiosity at the human man limping along beside her. Ugak Ashwalker, one of the guards said in accented but clear common speech, his gaze sliding to John with frank appraisal. "You bring a strange guest to the Reach." "I bring my claimed husband," Ugak said, without hesitation, and John felt the words settle over him this time not as a shocking public gambit but as simple, solid truth. "I would speak with Chief Grelka before the night is out. There is a matter of clan law to settle, and a bounty man not far behind us who I expect will not have the sense to leave well enough alone." Chief Grelka Ashwalker received them in the great hall at the settlement's heart, a broad-shouldered orc woman well into her middle years, her face seamed with old scars and older authority, seated on a carved wooden chair before a fire large enough to roast a full boar. She listened without interruption as Ugak told the whole story, the fire in John's field the night they met, the pit-fighting past he had confessed and turned from, Edric Thorne's death, and the truth of it, the bounty, the fire that had taken the mill, the blood claim spoken in Greywater Crossing's Market Square before witnesses who had not yet had time to doubt it. "You made a blood claim on a human wanted for murder," Grelka said finally, her voice carrying no particular warmth, "before you had brought the matter before your chief. That is not nothing, Ugak. That is clan law bent to the shape of your own wanting." "I know it," Ugak said, standing straight and unflinching before her chief in a way that told John, watching from beside her, exactly how much courage the old orc customs still commanded from her even now. "I do not ask you to pretend the claim was made in proper order. I ask you to judge the man himself, and the truth of what happened at Thornhollow, and decide whether the Ashwalker line is diminished by protecting an innocent man from an unjust bounty, or whether it is diminished by turning him away to please a human magistrate's wounded pride." Grelka's gaze moved to John, sharp and assessing in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of stepping into a fighting ring for the first time, facing an opponent who had already decided how the match would end. "You fought in the human pits," she said, "against my people among others." "I did," John said, meeting her eyes though every instinct told him to look away. "Years ago. I'm not proud of it. I stopped because I couldn't live with what it made of me, and I've spent every year since trying to be a man worth more than that. I won't pretend the shame of it away, Chief Grelka. I did what I did. But I never killed a man who didn't come at me first with intent to kill, not in the pits, not with Edric Thorne, not ever. I've spent my whole life since trying to hurt nothing and no one, and I love your kinswoman more than I have ever loved anything, and I would rather face the bounty man's rope honestly than let her lie for me to save my neck." Silence stretched through the great hall, broken only by the crackle of the fire, until Grelka finally rose from her chair, crossed the space between them, and studied John's face at close range with an intensity that made him fight the urge to flinch. "He speaks with a clean tongue," she said at last, to Ugak rather than to him. "Whether that is honesty or simply a skilled fighter's practiced calm, I cannot yet say for certain. But I have known you since you were a girl too stubborn to admit when a horse had thrown her, Ugak Ashwalker, and I have never once known you to love foolishly or without cause. I will honor the blood claim provisionally until this bounty matter is settled beyond doubt. If the man who hunts him arrives at my gates demanding his death, he will find the Ashwalker clan stands with its own, and you, Ugak, whatever the shape of the claims making, are undeniably one of my own." It was not, John understood, an unqualified blessing. Grelka's eyes still held a hard edge of judgment reserved, watching, waiting to see what he would become in the trial ahead. But it was enough in that moment to nearly buckle his knees with relief, and Ugak's hand found his and gripped it tight enough to bruise. her own relief plain on her face for the first time since they had fled the burning plateau. Sela's Marrow arrived at the foot of Ashwalker reached 2 mornings later, not with the 4 riders who had first come to the mill, but with nearly a dozen, the black-and copper sash of the magistrate's household joined now by 3 men wearing the plainer gray of the Crown's own road warden's proof. Ugak murmured grimly, watching them approach from the ridge above the settlement's gate. That Marrow had used the delay to convince someone with real authority that a fugitive sheltering among orcs was worth an official escalation. Ashwalker clan, Marrow called up from the trail below, his voice carrying easily on the thin mountain air. I have a warden's writ now, not merely a bounty paper. John Crawford stands accused of murder before the Crown's own justice, and harboring him is now harboring a fugitive from Crown law, treaty or no treaty. Hand him over, or face the consequence of standing against the Crown itself. Grelka came to stand at the gate herself, flanked by a dozen of her own warriors, Ugak and John among them, and John felt the old cold clarity of the fighting pits settle over him again. Not fear exactly, but a fighter's readiness, the understanding that whatever happened in the next hour would decide the whole shape of the rest of his life. The Crown's writ means little on Ashwalker ground, Grelka said, her voice carrying easily despite its lack of shouting. But I am not a chief who seeks war over a matter that might be settled otherwise. This man stands accused of murdering the magistrate's nephew. I am told he claims the death came in self-defense, against a man who attacked him first with a hidden blade. Is there any among your party who witnessed the death itself, bounty man, or do you carry only a magistrate's grieving assumptions dressed up as a warden's writ? Marrow's jaw tightened. There were witnesses at the granary. Servants of the magistrate's household. Servants of the very household that stands to lose face and coin if the truth proves otherwise, Grelka said dryly. That is not impartial witness, bounty man. That is convenience wearing witnesses' clothing. She turned to John directly. I understand there is a custom among your people, farmer, older even than this Crown's newest laws, trial by combat, where the truth of a man's claim is tested not by the word of interested parties but by what he is willing to stake his own life to defend. Is this still practiced among the border courts? It is, John said slowly, understanding dawning with a cold weight in his stomach. Rarely. But it's still on the old books, for cases where witnesses conflict and no clear proof exists either way. Trial by combat, judged binding by whichever Crown magistrate agrees to oversee it. Then I propose this, Grelka said, addressing Marrow and the road wardens both. Let this John Crawford face whichever champion the Crown's wardens put forward, under the old trial law here and now, before witnesses from both our peoples. If he loses, the Ashwalker clan will not stand in the way of the Crown's justice, whatever it decides to exact. If he wins, the bounty is cleared, the writ withdrawn, and this matter ends here, on this mountainside, rather than in a war neither of our peoples truly wants. One of the road wardens, a broad man with the look of a soldier long accustomed to settling disputes with his fists, stepped forward and spoke lowly to his companions before turning to address Grelka. The Crown recognizes trial by combat in matters of unclear witness. I'll stand as the Crown's champion myself, if the farmer's willing to stake his neck on his own story. John felt Ugak's hand close around his arm, hard enough to hurt. You do not have to do this, she said, low and urgent for his ears alone. There may be another way. There isn't, John said quietly. Not one that doesn't end in your clan going to war over me, and I won't have that, Ugak. Not after everything. I know how to fight. It's the one thing in this whole mess I actually know how to do. He turned to face her fully, cupping her face in both hands, ignoring the watching crowd entirely. I fought for 6 years to earn coin I hated earning. Let me fight once finally for something worth every bit of the cost, for us. For the life I want to build with you instead of running from. Ugak searched his face for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and curt, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Then win, she said fiercely. Win, John Crawford, because I did not carry you out of a burning field and claim you before a market square of strangers only to bury you on this mountainside. The fight was brutal and short. John Crawford had not swung a real weapon in earnest in over 2 years, and his bad leg betrayed him twice in the opening exchanges, nearly costing him everything against a warden trained and sharp, and 20 years his junior, but 6 years in the pits had taught him things that did not fade with disuse. How to read an opponent's weight before a blow landed, how to turn a bigger man's momentum against him, how to endure pain without losing the clarity to keep fighting through it. When the warden overextended on a heavy overhand strike, certain his size would end the match quickly, John sidestepped on his good leg, caught the man's wrist, and used the fighter's trick of leverage rather than strength to put him flat on his back in the dirt with a blade at his throat before the man could recover his footing. The mountainside went silent. John knelt there, chest heaving, blade unmoving at the warden's throat, and looked up at Grelka rather than pressing the killing stroke. "I don't want to kill him," John said, loud enough for the whole gathered crowd to hear. "I told your chief I've spent 2 years trying to be a man who doesn't take lives for coin or crowns or anyone's satisfaction. I've proven what I came here to prove. I'll not add another death to a day that's already had enough of them threatened." He withdrew the blade and stood, offering the fallen warden a hand up, which the man took after a startled pause, and Grelka's voice rang out clear across the mountainside. "The trial is won, fair and witnessed. The old law is satisfied. John Crawford's claim of self-defense stands proven by the truth of what he has shown here today, a man who fights only when cornered, and shows mercy the moment the fight is won. The bounty is cleared. Let no crown writ trouble him further on this matter. By the old law both our peoples still honor." Merrow's face had gone the color of ash. His authority evaporated before a dozen witnesses from both sides of a treaty he had gambled recklessly against. And even the road wardens, bound now by the very law they had invoked, offered him no support as he backed toward his horse, muttering promises of appeals to magistrates who would, everyone present understood, find themselves with very little appetite left for pursuing a matter so thoroughly and publicly resolved. "This isn't over," Merrow spat, swinging up into his saddle. "It is," Grelka said with the flat finality of a chief who has settled 100 such disputes and recognized the shape of a beaten man dressing up his defeat as an open question. "Go home, bounty man, and be glad the Ashwalker clan is more patient than its reputation suggests." Merrow rode off down the mountain trail with his men, and did not come back, not that day, not in the weeks that followed, and eventually word would filter up through traders passing the reach that Magistrate Bramwell, faced with a widely witnessed trial by combat that had cleared the fugitive's name under old and binding law, had quietly let the matter die rather than invite further embarrassment upon his household's already tarnished name. John Crawford stood in the settling dust of the mountainside, his leg throbbing, his knuckles split, his heart pounding with an adrenaline that had nowhere left to go, and turned to find Ugak Ashwalker already closing the distance between them at a near run, and she caught him up in an embrace fierce enough to lift him half off his feet, laughing and crying at once in a way he had never seen from her before, and suspected he would treasure the memory of for the rest of his life. "I told you to win," she said into his shoulder, her voice thick. "I did not tell you to frighten me half to death doing it. I had a good reason to win," John murmured against her hair. "The best reason I've ever had for anything." They stayed at Ashwalker Reach through the remainder of that autumn, John's leg healing properly for the first time in years under the care of the clan's healers, who had remedies for old injuries that no human physician had ever offered him. Chief Grelka, whatever reservations she had voiced at their first meeting, watched John work alongside her people in the following weeks mending fences, helping repair a granary roof damaged in a summer storm, teaching a group of curious young warriors the basic footwork of pit-fighting defense in exchange for lessons in the spear. And her judgment of him softened visibly with each passing week. until by the time the first snow dusted the high peaks above the reach, she had taken to calling him. With something approaching genuine warmth, Ugak's stubborn little farmer, which John had decided to take as the highest compliment the formidable chief was likely to offer. When spring came, they returned together to the Windrow Plateau, to the burned husk of Ashwalker Mill, and found that the fire, terrible as it had spared enough of the foundation, and the stone millworks that rebuilding was possible rather than starting entirely anew. They rebuilt it together over the course of that season. John's carpentry skills learned, it turned out, from a father who had been a wheelwright before John ever set foot in a fighting pit, proving as useful as Ugak's knowledge of the old mill's particular quirks and needs. Neighbors who had once bought her flour and called her monster behind her back found themselves, awkwardly and gradually, revising their opinions as word spread of the orc widow who had faced down a bounty hunter, a market town's guard, and a crown warden's champion, all in defense of the quiet, decent man who now stood beside her at every market stall and town gathering, unafraid to be seen as exactly what he was, hers, wholly and gladly, and no longer even slightly ashamed of it. On the evening the new mill's sails first turned properly in the plateau wind, golden wheat rippling for acres in every direction under a sky gone rose and amber with the sunset, the very picture of the world John Crawford had once believed he had no right to hope for again. Ugak Ashwalker took his hand, drew him to stand facing her beneath the turning sails, and pressed her forehead to his in the old gesture her people used. She told him, only for bonds meant to last a lifetime. "I claimed you before I truly knew if I meant it," she said quietly, "in a market square before strangers, because it was the only weapon I had to keep you alive in that moment. I have spent every day since making certain the claim was true. I do not need a market square or a chief's blessing or an old law's trial to know it now. I choose you, John Crawford, not because you needed saving, and not because I needed saving either, though perhaps in our own ways we needed a little of both. I choose you because you are the first thing in 4 long years of grief that has made me want to build something new instead of simply enduring what remained. I spent most of my life thinking I was the kind of man people used and then walked away from," John said, his voice rough with feeling. "Pit bosses who cared what I could earn them and nothing else. A magistrate's nephew who thought my life was worth less than his gambling debt. I never once believed anyone would choose me, Ugak, not truly, not the way you have again and again from the very first night you carried me out of that wheat field. I don't have some grand claim of my own to make in return. I just have this. I'm not going anywhere. Not from you, not from this mill, not from any storm or fire or bounty man the world sends after us. Wherever you are is the only place I've ever actually wanted to belong." The windmill sails turned slow and steady above them, gold light spilling long across the rebuilt fields, and Ugak Ashwalker kissed John Crawford there beneath them with the whole plateau golden and quiet and entirely, finally, theirs. And neither one of them, in all the years that followed, ever again had cause to feel the particular ache of being unwanted or unseen or alone.